Students, welcome back to another in our series of lectures from your textbook, Culture and Values, 8th edition. This is part 2 of chapter 10, so we'll pick up right where we left off last time. This is music from the School of Notre Dame. This is very significant here in that this is the beginning of modern day musical notation. There was a monk by the name of Guido d'Arizo who came up with who created a notation system that we still use today. It's still the basic system that we use, even though that it's changed some. This was in the 11th century. This was in use with much of the polyphonic music of the day, specifically the polyphony of organum. Now, we're going to be using some technical terms here, so I just want to share this with you. Any area of specialization has its own vocabulary. Music is no different. So please don't let the fact that we're using words that you might not be that familiar with intimidate you in any way. I encourage you to do some reading in your textbook to get a background on this. You can also Google the definitions, but we'll try to define some of this as we go. When we're talking about polyphonic music, polyphonic literally means poly, many, phonic, sound, or phony, like microphone, headphone. And so we're talking about many voices. And so in this music, which came to be known as organum, there were parallel voices above a basic melody that they called plain chant. In this particular form of polyphony, the one voice was the first harmony, and there were many of these songs and melodies that were actually borrowed from the church and used in secular music. For instance, the troubadours, the trouviers, the minnesingers. Minnesingers were literally love song singers. And so, again, they would borrow these melodies from church songs and put secular music to them. And we find a lot of this happens historically where melodies are borrowed back and forth. Secular musicians borrow from the church melodies. People writing for the church music, they borrow from the secular melodies. And this is still done even today with music that's called public domain, where there's no owner and you don't have to pay any kind of music copyright on it. So this was one of those types of music that was very popular during this particular time. One of the big players was Leonin in his Magnus Liber Organi, a collection of his music. He used this for music in the church, for the liturgy. His successor was Periton. Periton used counterpoint. Again, we're talking about some of the early uses of harmony here. And we have those in hymn books even to this day. If you grew up in church like me, you may have been singing counterpoint all of your life and just may not have been familiar with the term. Again, when you would have these different voices on top of a basic voice, it created harmony, just like we have today. And this made possible a particular form of church music called the motet. The motet were three voices above a basic melody. The tenor line usually formed the melody. Tenor literally meant to hold. It was based on what they called the cantus firmus. That's a Latin term meaning fixed song. And so the second line was called the duplum. The next line, the third line, called the triplum. The fourth line called the quadruplum. And so this made for a very, very sophisticated music, and this reflected the complexity of the cathedral that we looked at earlier. Here's a copy of this type of early music. We can see this early notation style. Notice it only has 1, 2, 3, 4 lines rather than the 5 lines that we have today, and rather than the more sophisticated system of notes that we have with stems and different types of notes, they have these, which basically just showed you the direction of the pitch. They called them neumes. We call them notes today. These are illustrated, as you can see by the pictures, and they were an art form in of themselves. It was during this time that we see the rise of the universities, and this resulted from scholasticism, where there was a demand for an educated class. Now, again, it was driven by money. With these new societies, you need lawyers and clerks and administrators in all of these growing cities. And so this supported the socio-economic structure. There was also an intellectual and cultural need here because, as we mentioned, they've rediscovered the ancient classical texts such as Plato, Aristotle, and the ancient Greek and Roman writers. Interestingly, there's a relationship with the Arab scholars. I think we mentioned earlier in part one that the Muslims were actually the ones that preserved these ancient classical writings. So there being this need to be able to translate them, that made a great need for scholars. And there was also a renaissance of legal studies during this time, especially at the University of Bologna, and science and math studies that were imported into Europe from the Arabs. All of these schools were held in the cathedral. And again, this was the forerunner of the modern day university. All universities originally were church schools, religious schools. There was no such thing as a secular or a state school back then. Dialectics are very important. Dialectics mean applying the principles of logic to the study of philosophy and even scripture. And so some of the things that we've been doing in this class on the principles of logic would be things that they would study back then as well. One of the major teachers was Peter Abelard. Abelard basically founded the concept that the teacher was the school. You went to a particular school to partake of the teachings of a particular great teacher. So this resulted in the rise of what we call scholasticism. Scholasticism was an attempt to reconcile the apparent contradictions of Scripture with other studies. So there was this relationship between academics and the Bible. We've talked about that before, but we just want to re-emphasize that. This is an illustration of the school at Bologna that we mentioned earlier in the 14th century. Notice that the teacher sits way up high. It's not today like when the teacher lectures, he or she stands up. The teacher always remained seated, but it was in an elevated position, symbolizing that this was the seat of wisdom. And then, of course, the students all sit in a lower position here. You may see something familiar. Some things never change. Over here in the bottom right, one of the students has fallen asleep. You also got a couple of other students here that just don't look that interested. You got a couple here that are carrying on in conversation. So, not unlike some classes even today. We do see the rise of the university system. We mentioned that most of this is centered in Paris. Paris becomes the great leader in this. And again, the students are coming here because of the teacher. University gets its name from universitas, which is just another name for a guild or a corporation. We mentioned that that was the origin of the university back in part one. The magistry, or the teachers, formed the corporation. So the school was looked at in some ways as a business as well as being church related. So you had teachers like William of Champeaux, you had Peter Abelard, and these formed the basis of the Universitas with the magistry, which literally means doctors. And that's why even to this day, the terminal degree, the PhD, whatever it might be, your highest possible degree is called a doctorate or a doctor's degree. There was quality control in the teaching profession here. The students sometimes would form the corporation, which meant that the teacher was accountable to them. We also have the idea of art versus theology. Theology and the arts finally split into separate schools, and there's student financial assistance, even as there is today. The primary support was supposed to come from the family and then benefactors, the church, and civil groups. You may or may not be surprised to know that the curriculum was very harsh. Student life was considered harsh. Books were very expensive, so most students couldn't afford them, and so they had to take a lot of notes, many times copying the entire book rather than paying for it. There were oral exams, and that's the basis for the modern practice of orals when you get a master's or a doctorate degree. There were debates, even as there are today. And if you look at classic works like the Canterbury Tales, which many of you may have read in high school, you actually see stories of this since the Canterbury Tales were written and situated in that particular time period of the High Middle Ages. Student culture and lifestyles were very, very lean. The starving student was common even in that day, too. The more things change, the more they stay the same. St. Golius was said to be a mystical saint of wandering scholars, and this was invented by the students so that they could have their own patron saint. The Goliardic verses were written to honor St. Golius, and in works like the Carmina Burana, we see similar activities to some students today. Drinking songs, unrequited love, end of semester blues, and sex. Again, more things change, the more they're the same. In the Carmina Burana, there was a composer by the name of Karl Arf that in the year of 1935 actually put some of these poems to music. This was obviously much later years in the 20th century. As you might have expected, women at this period of history are not admitted to the universities. However, you shouldn't take that to mean that there were no educated women during this time. They could be educated by private tutors or in convents if they were nuns. And as a matter of fact, by the 14th century, the University of Salerno was licensing women physicians. So women did make gradual progress in later years on that. This probably shouldn't surprise us because even in the United States of America in much later years, women were not allowed in colleges for the most part until the 1920s, if you can believe that, less than 100 years ago. As we mentioned, there were a few exceptions to the rule in Italy and in Germany that were actually even licensing women doctors in later years. This brings us to a very interesting historical figure, St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was a monk and he founded the Mendicant Brotherhood. They took a vow of poverty, so they were dedicated to a life of total poverty, and they moved around a lot so that they could preach their message, kind of similar to what we might call a brotherhood. They imitated the humanity of Christ, and by that we're talking about what they referred to as the stigmata. By stigmata, we're talking about the literal wounds that Jesus bore in his body due to the crucifixion, the marks in the hands, the marks in his feet, and they wanted to participate even in that. In that, they were talking about the literal interpretation of the Gospels, and this resulted in what we referred to once again as the stigmata. Because of this, they took a very, I guess we would call it an earthy approach to their ministry, emphasizing the goodness of God's creation. They took this so literally that they had a concern for all creatures. As a matter of fact, St. Francis was said to go out into the woods and preach to the birds. He took it that seriously, the importance of the natural world. They also held that there were one of two great impulses of late medieval culture. And of those two, we're talking about the affective and the emotional aspect of religion. So, of these two great impulses, they're emphasizing these particular things. Here's a depiction of St. Francis. Looks a little otherworldly compared to the way we would depict people today, but this was the artistic style. Notice the panel of the St. Francis altarpiece, and St. Francis looks forward to speak directly to you, speak directly to the saint. We get our word for San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, from St. Francis even today. Now do notice the stigmata, the holes here in the hands, down here in the feet. When Paul speaks about participating in the suffering of Christ, they were taking this very, very seriously. Not that they would put these marks necessarily in their hands and feet, but they wanted to participate in the suffering of Jesus in a very literal way. Another important individual, St. Thomas Aquinas. He was an intellectual and a mystic, said to be the master of the sacred page. Aquinas is studied to this day in theology schools and seminaries and in colleges and universities in general as a great historical figure. He was the predominant teacher in what is called the Golden Age of the University of Paris, that being during the 13th century. St. Thomas sought to harmonize reason and revelation. Because these colleges sought to take on an international character, they brought in teachers from many countries, and this is when St. Thomas was brought in. He was, of course, a commentator on the Bible, and he taught things like reading and disputing, which would be logic and argumentation, what we would call debating today, and then, of course, preaching. He also, surprisingly, composed hymns, though maybe not quite so surprisingly. And there were a number of classic works of the day that he composed during this time. He did seek to find this middle ground between reason and revelation. This was called fideism and rationalism. Fideism being that religious faith is indifferent to reason, and rationalism being that revelation must meet the test of human reason. So he sought to harmonize these things, to perhaps find a middle ground between the two that would make sense. His great work was known as the Summa Theologica, Summa meaning highest, Theologica meaning theology. And so he said the solution between these two ideas of fideism and rationalism is that we must trust God for the things that cannot be known by human reason, but everything else is subject to scrutiny. Everything else should be subject to reason. As you might have guessed, since they're rediscovering the classic works of antiquity, Aquinas was very influenced by Aristotle and the intellectual tradition of Aristotle. He used texts that were translated directly from the Greek, and he believed faith to be very, very compatible with reason, and we would call this the Aristotelian worldview, a worldview influenced by Aristotle. Another thing that he advocated was the hierarchical and synthetic worldview, and by that we mean by means of a hierarchy, everything has a function in the universe under God. God created everything with a purpose, and synthetic meaning that everything fits and has its place in the universe. Here in this work, we see what is known as the Triumph of St. Thomas Aquinas. This was created probably around 1365 AD, and we see the high view that they had of Aquinas. Aquinas is pictured as enthroned with the Old and New Testament figures. He's the personification of virtue, the sciences, and the liberal arts, and that's why we see all of those things depicted here below. he was possibly influenced by Dante, who attended this school. Speaking of Dante, it's appropriate for us here to mention the Divine Comedy, one of the most famous works in Western history. Since they believe that all learning starts with the senses, and of course they're getting that from Aristotle as opposed to his teacher Plato, he's very influenced by the intellectualism of this Parisian school. He holds that all learning follows this hierarchical and synthetic religious humanism, humanism being different back then from what we would call humanism today. So learning is basically climbing this hierarchy, which leads finally to the light of course being God. And reason and revelation make up the true knowledge of God. So he was responsible for a wide array of publications, but by far the most famous is the Divine Comedy, or sometimes known as the Comedy of Dante Alighieri. The Divine Comedy is said to be to literature what the Cathedral and the Summa Theologica were to their areas. It depicts the idea of a symbolic journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And so we have the inferno representing hell, the purgatory, paradise, all of these things. There's a careful organization within this particular work. There are 100 cantos or songs. There are 32 cantos for each section. One canto is in the introduction. And then there is this terza rima, which we just brought up, which refers to the rhyme scheme that's used within these particular cantos. The work itself is very encyclopedic, which means it has a very wide variety of things and very, very complex. Again, one of the most famous works in Western history. Here's a depiction of Dante. He's shown with the laurel wreath around his head. Even to this day, a poet laureate is said to be the highest award that a poet can receive. He was one of the earliest recipients of this. It was a great honor back in classical times during the Greeks and the Romans, and this is why they bring it back again during this high Middle Ages. There's great symbolism in the Divine Comedy. We mentioned the fact there's a journey, and the guides in this particular work are said to be Virgil, and this goes back to the great influence of the classical literature, Virgil being a very famous individual from the ancient Roman civilization. Now, why is Beatrice there? Beatrice is said to be a symbol of the unrequited love. By unrequited, we mean love that's never returned. It's not reciprocated there. You love somebody, but they don't love you back. And Beatrice is said to be an individual that represents this type of unrequited love in Dante's life. There's a use of numbers, specifically symbolic numbers, and there's multiples of three, of course, three representing the Trinity. That's the significance of that number. There's punishments and blessings. Of course, these are symbolic punishments in his work, symbolic punishments in hell, and symbolic blessings in or rewards in heaven. There's also these very frightening depictions of Satan. Satan is said to be the furthest from the light and warmth of God, and that's why hell is depicted more towards the interior of the earth where the sun can't reach and there's not the warmth of the sun. And so his fall from grace is said to be so great that he's in the very center of the earth. So light and darkness, once again, take on a great meaning here. We see that even in modern day works like Star Wars. Luke Skywalker, the sky, light, and he's always dressed in white clothing. And of course, Darth Vader is dressed in black to represent the darkness. Hell is said to be intellectual estrangement from God. And since they emphasize the intellect so much, you can see why this would be the case. And so Satan is said to be depicted as somebody inarticulate and stupid because he has lost the good of intellect. In the ultimate damnation of hell, all in hell remain totally unfulfilled, cut off from the source of all rationality, that being God, the light. So this is said to be the definition of ultimate damnation. Here's the depiction of Satan that we talked about. Again, very grotesque, devouring the people. We see the serpents, of course, the symbolic imagery there, all kinds of things that depict this sort of grotesqueness. This is taken from a mosaic in the vault of the baptistry in the Florence Cathedral, again from the 13th century. This mosaic was said to have influenced Dante when he was just a young man, and even younger than that. When he was growing up, he would see this, and this had a great influence on him. Finally, another depiction of Dante here, Dante reading his poem. This was said to have been painted in about 1465. On the left, we see the depiction of hell. On the right, the depiction of heaven as the New Jerusalem. And it's depicted, interestingly, as the Florentine Cathedral, which still stands to this day in the city of Florence. It's on the left because in Latin, left means sinister, and of course, hell is a very sinister place. And that finishes our lecture on part 2. We'll see you next time for our next lecture.